You bet. Thanks, Rachel, and thanks everyone for joining in. All right, let's dig in. This is going to be a good time. I'm going to deal with some housekeeping here in a second, but as Rachel said, I'm Mace Vaughan, the Pollinator and Ag Biodiversity Program Co-Director at Xerces. I also serve as a partner biologist and conservation entomologist with the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. And I'll be circling back around to NRCS a few times on and off during this presentation and at the end. For those of you who don't know the NRCS, they have been a fantastic partner of Xerces for, oh my goodness, going on 16, 17 years now, helping to work with their farm and ranch community to really implement a lot of what we're going to talk about today. Can't say enough good stuff about that partnership, and I'll say some more later. I also want to give thanks to Nancy Adamson, a Senior Pollinator Conservation Specialist here at Xerces, and also a partner biologist with NRCS out of the East National Technology Support Center in Greensboro, North Carolina. Several of the sides, this whole presentation is based on a kind of a joint presentation she and I did back in August, specifically for the NRCS. And used a bunch of the slides that she put together for that presentation here. So I just wanted to thank her and acknowledge her work that went into getting some of this content together. So with that, as Rachel suggested, this presentation and webinar is part of an ongoing series of webinars that Xerces started back in, I guess actually I don't have the first one on here that I did, oh my goodness, I guess that was in February. Just a month ago, where we sort of laid out the case for incorporating or thinking about pollinators and beneficial insects and wildlife kind of biodiversity into working landscapes. That webinar was meant to sort of set the stage. Why do we care? Why are we doing this work? And that's available on YouTube, as well as a recent one that my colleagues Didi Soto and Stephanie Frischi did just a couple of weeks ago now in Spanish on pollinator conservation. Today we're focusing on working landscapes, and this is part of a whole series that I'll come back to at the end for the farm and ranch community about pollinators and beneficial insects in working landscapes. So feel free to share the news and spread it around. You can find more on our events website, as well as on our YouTube channel, and I'll come back to that again too. Also, paired up with this, Xerces for years has been doing webinars in collaboration with NRCS via the conservationwebinars.net website, which is where these are all stored. We have a couple coming up, one on beneficial invertebrates in our soil and another one on wetlands and pollinators, how water quality, actually I need to change that title, how practices designed to improve water quality in wetlands can benefit pollinators. These are both coming up here, this month. And you can go to conservationwebinars.net. If you go to that website and just search for Xerces or search for pollinators, you can find all sorts of past trainings there as well, on everything from pollinators and beneficial insects to dragonflies and freshwater mussels. Just an amazing diversity of outreach or trainings available there. So with that, for those of you who don't know Xerces, we've been around since 1971 with this core mission of protecting wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. And right now, boy, when I started 20 years ago, there are just 5 of us in a little office in Southeast Portland. Only one person worked full-time, and now we've got 55 staff working full-time all across the country. We've got regional offices in California and Connecticut, Indiana, Iowa, Maine, Minnesota, Nebraska, New Hampshire, New Jersey. I mean, just everywhere. It's super exciting, and it's a super honor to work with these folks. And across the organization, we work on pollinator conservation. We work on conservation biological control of pests. We've helped support agricultural biodiversity and endangered species, aquatic invertebrates. We work on pesticide protection and risk reduction, urban conservation. We have a certification that we manage for farmers who have adopted practices that are protective of pollinators called Be Better Certified. We've got an amazing collaboration and project called Bee City, Bee Campus, where we work with collaborators who are really fired up in their communities about pollinator conservation to support them in really framing up that work. And we do a ton of community science and where we're working with folks all across the country on bumblebee monitoring and monarch butterfly monitoring and other things. And really this webinar is part of a whole effort that Rachel oversees on just really pushing our outreach and supporting just everybody who we can to really help implement great work on the ground in their neighborhoods, in their farms, everywhere to support doing good habitat for invertebrates, but in so doing, really just get great habitat on the ground for all wildlife and biodiversity. So it's pretty exciting. It's been really fun to be part of this program and part of this effort. I specifically oversee a team of about 24, 25 staff spread across the country, 13 of whom are in partner biologists with the NRCS, either in field offices or state offices or regional offices, where they're working with farmers and ranchers as well as NRCS conservation planners, et cetera, to really help, help the rubber meet the road and get habitat and protect habitat on the ground. And I'll come back to these folks at the end, but I can't be prouder of this amazing team of folks that I get to work with. It's a huge honor. And we can't do this work without a tremendous number of partners and collaborators across the country. That includes over 12,000 members of the Xerces Society, hundreds of farmers and land managers that we've worked with on habitat and reduced risk pest management practices over the years, scores of private foundations, easily hundreds of scientists at universities around the world, dozens of federal, state, local agencies, over 50 companies provide support for our work, and thousands of people, like I am sure many of you, who are working and act to get, protect invertebrates in your neighborhoods, your farms, your ranches. Yeah, it's just like I said, it's a huge honor to work with all of you and to work with this amazing, all these collaborators. And if you are so inclined, we are donor-supported nonprofit, and you can donate today. You can become a member. You can get a sign. We have a new sign. Let's see if this comes up. There it goes. We have a new habitat sign. Yeah, it's just if you're interested in supporting our work, you are welcome to do so, and just helps us put on more presentations like these and really keep this amazing team running. With that, let's dive in. So the outline, sort of the overview for today's webinar is actually pretty simple, but I think there's going to be a lot of meat to sort of talk about. Related to that, actually, I'm going to come back to this. So I'm going to start off by just giving a review and an overview on just pollinator and beneficial insect habitat. Like, what are those habitat elements that are important, particularly in a farm or a ranch landscape? What are those habitat elements we're trying to look for or cultivate or increase or protect? And I want to just walk through that. It won't take us very long, just to kind of go through and get everyone's mind thinking about what are the sorts of things we're looking for in a farm or working landscape. Then I'm going to sort of move on to talking about how do we build, how do we create, what are creative ways that we bring that habitat into a working landscape? So we're not going to go into detail on site prep and seed mixes and planting design. The focus of today is really, how do we build an entire landscape? What elements do we bring into a farm landscape or a ranch landscape in order to really, maximize or even just bring in small elements of habitat to increase the populations of pollinators and other beneficial insects on the ground. And I'm going to go through example after example, talking a little bit about pros and cons and creative ways to tweak these different practices on the ground. And while I'm doing that, I encourage all of you that are, to think about work you've done on the ground, efforts you've, either implemented or thought about. And then after I get through going through what's going to be quite a number, like a lot of pictures, I want to spend some time through the Q&A having you share with me some of the ideas that you've had that you think I maybe haven't, that I haven't touched upon. And then we can have a, kind of a discussion. It might be a little one-sided, but I'll read kind of what you all put into the Q&A. And yeah, we'll just get even more ideas on the ground. And I've got a new way I'm going to try to sort of illustrate as you all talk about different things or bring different ideas up. Yeah, to kind of share them out with everybody. So please, as we go along, yeah, just be thinking about that as we kind of go through these examples. And, you know, this is your chance to teach me something new or give me some new ideas to think about that then share back with my team. Yeah, and then we'll just wrap up talking about resources and any other questions you all may have. With that, I want to start off with just a quick, maybe 3 poll questions here, just to get a sense of who all's on today. It looks like we've got about 70 people participating. It'd be great to get a sense of your role, and then I got a couple other questions after this. So Rachel, if you're able to pull up the first poll, excellent, that's great. Yeah, let's see, get a sense of who all's on today. All right. Let's give this a moment. These are actually, yeah, I kind of nerd out on the webinar technology. Maybe I've just been doing this for way too long. It's pandemic. It's just going on. All right. Let's see. Got about 50, coming up on 55 people chiming in. All right, so we've got quite a mix of folks. This is great. Well, let me just expand my screen here. Wow, okay. Farmers, number of farmers, at least one rancher out there. Okay, I'm gonna make sure I got something for you. Oh, excellent. Okay, a few people working on forestry. Okay, that's good. And I'll have a couple of thoughts there. Maybe we'll dig a little deeper. You'll have to keep me honest. Gardeners, master gardeners, interested community members, a few folks, and good to see, always happy to see NRCS online, as well as the conservation districts, nonprofit conservation planners, and a few others, undefined, well, a few others, educators, master naturalists, others. Excellent. All right, cool, good. All right, so we've got quite a spread. We'll try to make sure we've got something for everybody. My next question helps me get a sense too of what's your experience been to date. Have you created or incorporated pollinator or beneficial insect habitat onto your farm, ranch, or forest in forest management, or helped a landowner to do this work? Let's get a sense of, I just want to get a sense of how much time and thought you all put into this already. Okay, let's see. Just a few more coming in. 75%. All right. It's looking like about 80, a little more than 80% of y'all have done and thought about this work. That is fantastic. And for those of you who haven't, yeah, no worries. I mean, from this, I hope we come away with, yeah, a ton of ideas for you to think about. So there'll be, I think there's going to be a win-win for everybody. And my last question is, if you have implemented some sort of beneficial insect habitat project or projects, has that, you know, beneficial insect conservation, has the pollinators or the pest control been the primary goal, or was it a secondary, you know, goal or a secondary resource concern while you were addressing some other priority, like such as erosion control or water quality or something like that? I just want to get a sense of how often you design projects just for pollinators and beneficial insects, and how much you're thinking, yeah, I've got these other goals. You know, I got to stabilize a stream bank, but maybe I'll throw some willow in and do it that way. All right, excellent. Okay, so we've got about coming up on 20% of folks who haven't done anything yet, and a bunch of you where, yeah, focused where pollinators have been primary, secondary, and both. Excellent. Okay, good. All right, this is great. You are my perfect audience, so this will work. I'm liking it. Okay, with that, let's dive in. So let's talk here. We're going to start off here by just reflecting on and reviewing pollinator and beneficial insect habitat. So no surprises here when we're dealing with any sort of wildlife habitat, whether you're working on a large farm, a ranch, urban area, whatever it might be. Pollinators, other beneficial insects are going to need food and water, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So we're talking nectar, we're talking pollen, we're talking host plants. We're going to be looking for shelter, and we'll dig a little bit here into nest sites and overwintering sites for our pollinators. and then some sort of safe haven or protection from pesticides, but also other disturbance, as I'll dig into in a moment. So let's just reflect for a moment on the native trees, shrubs, wildflowers, and grasses. We tend to focus more on natives because they support a greater biodiversity. But hey, we're in working landscapes, we're in homes and gardens. If you've got non-native plants that work great, that also provide some of these resources and aren't going to be a big weed, let's do it. I'm looking here to be creative and open-minded as we look at different ways to bring habitat in. So we'll keep coming back to that. But whether you're a pollinator or a predator or a parasitoid that's attacking a crop pest, you need to have that pollen and nectar or alternative prey. Additional aphids that aren't pests, for example, are really helpful to have in the landscape if you're trying to increase the number of parasitoid wasps or predaceous flies that are going to be out there eating those critters or able to move into your broccoli or your apple orchard in order to hit those aphids there. It's good to have those resources, those alternative prey in the landscape. And this food, this nectar and pollen and prey and host plants, even in the landscape, needs to be, also ideally as much as possible, a refuge from disturbance. So there needs to be refuge out there, a protected place when crops are harvested or habitats managed or pesticides are used. How do we help make sure we've got places in the landscape where, we're able to sustain those beneficial insects while disturbances may be happening elsewhere. So in this, what I like about this is, we're showing here too, this idea of having bloom through time with early blooming plants like maple and willow, all the way to late blooming plants like goldenrod and blazing star, depending on where you are in the country. And when we're selecting plants, we're thinking about that habitat element. We're really looking for high value plants for pollinators. Used to be, we talked a lot about color and shape and all this. That's fine. But frankly, I just want to know that we're putting plants on the landscape that have, ideally a documented, but where we see a ton of bees and butterflies and wasps and other good critters on them. So, ideally, as we're building these landscapes across the landscape, this is a mix of perennials and biennials and annuals, where we've got plants that will come in at different stages in the development of a habitat, ideally things that are going to bloom right away. So we've got habitat on the ground, but then other plant species that might move in over time and bloom a little bit, later in the development of a new habitat, so that we're kind of really able to ideally jumpstart things and then keep having that habitat improve its ability to support beneficial insects over time. And where we can, having bloom available early, mid, and late in the season is huge for really, for helping out. I will say though, don't let this idea of having bloom available year round get in the way of being able to putting in something like a cover crop, where we'll get a big splash of flowers maybe at one time in the year. Adding habitat to the landscape and having that habitat, those forage resources consistently available, allows us to continue to build those populations in the landscape. But where we can, having bloom available all year long is, all growing season long. I mean, that's the ideal. That'd be the goal. We want to choose site appropriate plants. We want to be focusing on pesticide free seed or plants. If we're putting plugs in the ground, if we're putting potted plants in the ground that are really geared towards pollinators, making sure they haven't been treated with systemic insecticides that for the first year or so may be coming out in the pollen and nectar, that can be problematic. And ideally, we're thinking about host plants and nesting plants for butterflies and bees, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here. So we also need to think about nesting, and this can happen in a wide variety of places across the landscape. And we're thinking about and looking for things like cavities or twigs or snags. So maybe it's cavities in the ground below lodge grasses where you might find bumblebees nesting. Maybe it's tunnels or pithy stems where bees are moving in and nesting in tunnels. Maybe this is ground that's not being tilled year after year. That's nice and stable, where you might have ground nesting bees digging underground here and here, building their nests and provisioning their nests underground. And we need to think too about nesting materials. So are there appropriate plants where leafcutter bees can be cutting out leaf pieces to dig? Is there clean mud that, you know, different wasps and bees can be collecting to build their nests and to, you know, to really help those tunnel nests, for example, have walls, or in the case of mud daubers that might be collecting cabbage loopers, can we, you know, have the mud, clean mud available for them to build their nests so that they can be doing work for us on the farm, you know, gathering crop pests. So we need to think about this. So plants that support tunnels, stable bare ground, ideally on south-facing slopes that are drier, potential cavities where bumblebees might move in. These are all nesting elements that we need to be thinking about, as well as those nesting resources. And if we're thinking specifically about bumblebees for a little bit, they both need that nest site, which is that, you know, maybe it's overgrown areas where rodents have had nests where they've moved out of, and then the bumblebee queens will dig right in. But they also need overwintering sites. Maybe that's under roots and brush piles and leaf litter, back under lodged tall grasses and thatch that's on the ground, or straw mulch. You know, any sort of undisturbed area back in the wood edge can be great habitat, particularly if there's a deep organic layer of humus and pine needles and fir needles and things like that. Things that if you're in the east, the earthworms haven't managed to drag underground. These are places where bumblebee queens are going to dig in. And then if we've got that same sort of habitat, usually along a wood edge or someplace outside of the woods that's a little bit warmer, you know, those same types of organic layers are places where rodents may have dug in and left cavities behind. And then you've got the, you know, queens moving in and, you know, setting up their nests in places like that. So thick organic matter, these are the sorts of things that we're looking for bumblebees, both queens to overwinter and for nest sites. You know, we could think about trying to protect those areas from disturbance. That'll come up again and again, but these, you know, hedgerows and wood edges, you know, areas where we've got a lot of pithy stemmed or hollow stem plants. You know, if you're in the east, rotting wood is a place where a lot of bees, particularly these emerald green sweat bees, will nest. Thinking about protecting those areas, you know, something we'll come back to again and again. Another interesting thing to think about that we don't, pardon me, I'm just going to do this, that we don't, that we're focusing on more and more at Xerces is also, can we get plants on the landscape that support pollen specialists? So bees that, you know, only use a particular plant like asters or native thistles or golden aster, cucurbits, sunflowers. You can see the list here. There are a number of plant species and groups that support unique specialist bees, where this is the only flower they'll gather pollen from. And so we're increasingly thinking about how do we bring those floral resources into the landscape to really up our game in terms of the biodiversity and the diversity of these native bees that we're supporting. And related to that, of course, are host plants for butterflies, and thinking about that as much as we can. The monarch butterfly, as an example here, stands out because of its overall decline on the eastern population and its catastrophic decline here in the west. I was just looking at some things today, and, you know, for those of you who track it, we were only able to document about 1,900 overwintering monarch butterflies in the west, which means, you know, only a few hundred female butterflies heading out more or less now to try to start this year's migration. And, you know, compare that to the millions that were overwintering on the California coast just maybe 20 or 30 years ago. And it's pretty dramatic. So getting milkweed on the landscape is critically important, but also other host plants for other butterfly species. To help think about this, and we're not going to go into great detail here, but on our website, we've got a whole landing page with our habitat assessment guides that really help you step back and think about all these different resources that could be occurring in the landscape, and to help you kind of think about evaluating whether they're there. For those of you who are interested in, you know, more urban or suburban yards, gardens, and parks, we've got a relatively new set of guidelines here for helping you assess those resources. And it's a useful place to go to kind of get your head around this whole variety of habitat resources in the landscape. So that's just sort of a quick overview there. So just thinking, you know, we want bloom through time, pollen and nectar, host plants, specialist host plants, nesting sites, overwintering sites. We're ideally thinking about having all of these resources in the landscape. I want to make it clear though, they don't all have to be in the same place. I mean, if you're working, I mean, heck, if you're a homeowner and you just have a yard and a home, you know, having resources spread there. If you're a farmer and you've got, you know, a decent sized property, you can have these resources spread out around the farm or the ranch, or even the forest, and be part of a landscape that's supporting a great abundance of pollinators and beneficial insects. And so as I go through these examples, I want you to keep in mind, not just things you've thought of and projects you've implemented on the ground, but also recognize that as much as we can, we're trying to create a landscape where all these different pieces add up to support all of those resources, but they don't have to be all in the same place at the same time. So with that in mind, what I want to do is kind of dig in and start thinking about habitat examples. And this landscape here, this is sort of my generic, you know, this kind of does it all for me except for a rangeland. So I apologize to the ranchers on board today. I will have some ranching examples to think about as we, or some livestock management examples to think about as we go further along. But this kind of lets me look at, you know, at least we've got forests here and sort of a generic kind of, not generic, but sort of an example farm landscape. I'm going to come back to this as a way to kind of illustrate where we might have a habitat on the ground. This is what when I see a landscape like this, you know, my mind just starts cranking with ideas. So we're going to start talking about some of those ideas shortly. But the other thing I want to think about, and many of you already are, is ideally, you know, we're designing habitat to have multiple benefits. So maybe we're also working on water quality protection, so capturing sediments or capturing nutrients. Maybe we're thinking more and more about climate change resilience, trying to make sure we've got strong pockets of habitat that can, you know, frankly, help us move native plant communities or help us shift native pollinator communities around, or just help existing pollinator communities, even honeybees and beekeepers, you know, deal with change, you know, more extreme drought and more extreme wet, more extreme cold and heat as, you know, sort of climate change continues to move on. How do we just build drought resilient and tolerant landscapes to really help give biodiversity and wildlife a good foothold? Maybe you're focused on soil quality. Maybe you're focused on wildlife habitat and corridors or buffers against adjacent pesticide use. You know, as we expand, as not so much as farming expands, but as urbanization and suburbanization expands, there's more and more farming coming up against, you know, subdivisions and building. So can we create, you know, use practices that might help create visual barriers and beautify landscapes, you know, gorgeous hedgerows that provide a nice visual buffer between, say, farming and, you know, a local, some sort of, you know, building infrastructure, do something that's, you know, pretty and good for wildlife and pollinators all at the same time. Maybe we're working on screening dust or noise reduction, or, you know, maybe you've got weed issues where you've got weed seed blowing in and we want to create some structure that's going to try to capture that weed seed before it enters the farm. Maybe you're, you know, doing native seed or other seed production and need to increase your crop isolation distances, or maybe you're looking at carbon sequestration. There are just a whole number of reasons why we might put either permanent or temporary habitat on the ground or manage the habitat a little bit differently that could achieve any number of these goals. And I'm a big fan of stacking traits. Like, I want to stack as many benefits as we can, because sure, sometimes this beneficial insect habitat pays in increased pollination or increased pest control. But it's going to pay even more in the long run if we're thinking about other natural resource concerns and other reasons and how we can kind of tie these goals together. And I think in that way, we really come up with some win-win-win solutions. All right, so give me a second here. So I want to walk through now just a whole number of examples of projects that Xerces or Xerces partners have worked on, just showing you different ways that we've brought this habitat into working landscapes. So farms, ranches, orchards, you name it, forest edges even. And one thing you'll notice is that I did not get rid of my NRCS practice standard numbers. So when NRCS works with landowners to design and plan and ultimately contract potentially for, financial assistance, projects on the ground. Those practices are tied to specific what are called conservation practices with specific numbers. I left them in here just in case as we go along, some of you want to have, be able to have a more informed conversation with a local field office or a conservation district office about financial or technical support. I don't know, having the numbers and the practice names, I kept a lot of those in here. So one practice that gets put on the ground is just called wildlife habitat planting. You'll see the 420, that's just a number. And this is a way to get habitat in the ground in any number of ways. And this is an example where working in an orchard that's actually Be Better certified. So this is an orchard that's achieved, had a third-party certifier in Oregon Tilth come on and document that they're meeting the standards that are set out in our Be Better certification. Here's an example of just, planting that they put on the ground, plugged it, it's all on drip irrigation, and they did this around their irrigation pond. Here's another similar, this was in Eastern Washington. We can move all the way to New Hampshire and to a collaboration with the University of New Hampshire and the NRCS in New Hampshire, putting in habitat on the ground here adjacent to blueberry field. Sometimes this is just creating wildflower meadows or native prairie and getting that seeded and put on the ground. Sometimes they're just, again, native wildflowers put in. This is an Oregon example next to berry crops here, where through time we're trying to have a whole variety of different plants in bloom. And this was a seeded project there. Here's another meadow project. This one, I think, in New Jersey. Again, just along a farm, just outside of a farm field. There are just a number of different ways we can get this habitat on the ground. Another practice conservation cover is what we used to use for, what many states still use for putting pollinator habitat in. In some cases, we can create this habitat, literally underneath the crop itself. So this is a vineyard, another Be Better certified farm in Washington, Klickitat Canyon, where they manage the understory of their vineyard for basically the spring ephemerals that come up. There's a huge bloom here in Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington in the springtime with mule's ear and balsam roots and lupins that just come up. And then as the season goes on, they dry out and maybe the native grasses come in, and they're able to, this vineyard's able to have this bloom in the springtime and then, continue the operation sort of without much disturbance or interference through the rest of the year when they're out there. Pivot corners are a place where you can use a number of practices to get habitat on the ground. This is particularly here in the West. We've got a lot of pivot corners that often end up just being big weed patches. Here's an example from the Grand Ronde Valley of Oregon, where this farmer's put in, spirea and rose and snowberry, very aggressive shrubs that provide valuable bloom for pollinators. So they were able to, put these aggressive shrubs in to outcompete weeds. Maybe they get a little extra overspray from the irrigation system, and just a clever way to bring a little extra habitat into what's pretty dry, overall pretty dry landscape. Field border is another practice, which is pretty intuitive in terms of both its name and what it means on the ground. This is another Be Better certified farm, Villicus Farms in north central Montana, that, oh goodness, I feel like this operation's now running 5,000 or 6,000 acres of dryland crops. And between each of their major blocks, they've got 30, 40 foot wide strips of native wildflowers on the ground that are meant to provide beneficial insects and define the farm and break it up, and really create a landscape that's hugely supportive of both the agriculture on the ground and just having beneficial insects that are attacking crop pests and maybe providing some pollination. These folks are growing mostly grains and pulse crops, so don't need anything for the grain, but it's good to have something that's attacking crop pests there. Yeah, but maybe for some of those pulse crops, maybe there's a bit of a benefit for pollination. Field borders also don't have to be native species. You could plant a bunch of clover. Let's plant a bunch of Phacelia. There's a whole variety of inexpensive, easy to establish, non-native plants that you could put on the ground that could have multiple benefits, both for beneficial insects as well as soil building, weed control, just a whole variety of things where you could stack those benefits up and yeah, get some increased habitat on the ground. Filter strips. So again, going back to the earlier talking about practices that capture sediments or capture nutrients. Here's an example from California, adjacent to, on the right-hand side over here, a vineyard, and on the other side of these mustards, a rotation of sunflowers and tomato and wheat. Here along, there's a slough, a little like a wetland drainage through here along this tree line and across. And so, putting Phacelia and poppies, native shrubs, there's a whole, variety of native plants to, targeting pollinators and beneficial insects planted here. And we could take this and, put it along irrigation canals or other riparian areas. Again, building habitat along, along these shorelines. This is, where are we at? We're down in Winters, California now at Hedgerow Farms, looking at an irrigation canal here. It's a great opportunity to get habitat, and, you can leave one side open so you can manage the canal, but along the other side have even a tree line set up or a hedgerow or something like that. So a lot of opportunities there. And speaking of hedgerows, hedgerows have become, particularly in the West, but increasingly in the Midwest and East, a really straightforward way, kind of a way to introduce a farm to getting beneficial insect habitat on the ground. You run a drip line, you do some basic weed control, get some aggressive shrubs in, a diversity of native shrubs, sure, maybe even some non-native ones if you want, but then maybe some plants in between, all on a drip line. So you're watering just your plants and not your weeds. And it's a pretty straightforward way to kind of get your head around getting some habitat in and have some really easy, relatively easy success in getting plants established. So here's an example of a hedgerow we planted many years ago next to a conventional almond orchard. Here's one in a, running along the tree lines and the road to this orchard. This is a really big organic almond orchard. Actually, this one too is Be Better certified. Just getting this habitat into these landscapes. Here's an example of a smaller hedgerow that runs through the center of a diversified organic farm in Idaho, just outside of Boise. Again, it's a mix of shrubs and wildflowers plugged in, a couple of rows wide, running down through the length of this farm. Here's actually a cherry grower that we've worked with for years in the Dalles in Eastern Oregon, putting a hedgerow between a cherry orchard and the road. Here again, this is a hedgerow that only has a couple of species in it. I want to say rose and spirea, maybe. I'm trying to remember what all is in there. But, sure, on the one end, you could create a hedgerow that's a whole 12 different species. On the other hand, you could, hone in and say, hey, look, these are two plants that I think would be really good to go with my cherry orchard that meet my own personal criteria. Hey, let's go for it. Anything we can do to get more resources on the ground. In this case, let's say, after coming on immediately after cherry bloom to kind of keep that bloom going in the landscape, and maybe be supporting some alternative hosts for some key cherry beneficial insects that might be attacking some key cherry pests. These are things we can be thinking about. Like you don't have to have everything all at once. Like let's get creative. There may be constraints if you're applying for certain farm bill programs, certain conservation programs. But the flip side is if you're just interested in this, I encourage everybody, and I'm hugely supportive of just thinking about what's going to work best for you, what's going to sort of meet your goals. So this is a great example here. We've actually, oh my goodness, this is a huge almond orchard in California, again, Be Better certified, that, planted a 3-row hedgerow. Actually, I guess ultimately it's a 7-row hedgerow running along a slough that runs through the middle of the orchard. The production along that area for almonds was really poor. And this farm set up a plan to protect this, this winding habitat from insecticide exposure. It's astounding. I mean, it's just an amazing pollinator beneficial insect resource right through the heart of this farm, connecting habitat areas, and designed to be protected from adjacent insecticide exposure. Pretty cool. And then these can be just little things along a farm road. Like here's a hedgerow in North Carolina. and a farm road coming into a blueberry farm, where the farmer here wanted to have something attractive, something that communicated, look at all this great habitat we can create and build up our native bees and bumblebees to be coming on board to pollinate that blueberry. Yeah, just a stunning photo. In Simple Hedge, another hedgerow on a demonstration farm, teaching farm at North Carolina Ag and Tech University in Greensboro. We could think again about not just sort of those canals and riparian cover, but any sort of riparian cover. Here's some electric line put up, electric fencing to protect this whole riparian zone. We could fill that with willow. And I encourage everybody, if you're going to plant willow, to focus on talking with your nurseries about getting male willow plants, because the male plant's going to be producing that pollen, and that's really the heavy hitter for early emerging bumblebee queens and a lot of our native solitary bees. That willow pollen is astounding. So any sort of riparian restoration can incorporate a ton of really beneficial plants that are doing the job of riparian stabilization and good habitat, but also, if we pick and choose correctly, killer habitat for pollinators. And they can also just be a bunch of herbaceous plants, shamelessly throwing in a picture of my kid from, my goodness, she's 17 now, so this was taken a while ago. Wetlands and a whole variety of landscapes. I like this one because here we are kind of in the sage steppe of the inland Northwest here in Shoshone, Idaho. And here's a wet area just outside of this farm that they actually planted with native grasses and showy milkweed. That's just, taking off great in this slightly wetter environment. So, wetlands become a place where you can create a lot of habitat. And we'll have a webinar coming up here, actually in collaboration with NRCS, not part of this series, but part of our NRCS series, just in a couple of weeks on wetlands and pollinator habitat. But I mean, there's just a tremendous opportunities when doing any sort of wetland work. I mean, this is full of bidens here, beggar's tick, but there are a number of different plants that are going to be supported in wetlands. And if you're in the West, it's less of a concern or an issue in the East, but in the West, where things are so dry from midsummer on, wetlands provide a fantastic place to have a lot of our late season bloom. Whether that's, Euthymia occidentalis, was that golden top, or a lot of our asters or other goldenrod or bidens or sunflowers. There are a number of plant species that will give us that late season bloom that we're often lacking in the edges of our wetlands, and we can think about too habitat in the uplands of those wetlands as well, which frequently need to be protected and managed at the same time that we're doing any sort of wetland restoration or wetland management. Cover crops, like if we think less about like habitat plantings and more about just, well, habitat isn't sort of semi-natural habitat, and we just get into cropping systems and, non-native plants, why not create and plant cover crops to have a benefit for, pollinators? You could have clovers and mustards and buckwheat and phacelia and sunflower. There's a whole variety of cover crop species that can achieve a whole suite of erosion control and soil health goals and soil invertebrate goals, but also be providing huge pulses of pollen and nectar in the landscape. So here's just a picture of buckwheat. Here's a photo of a young orchard. I forget where this one is, but planted the understory here, planted in clover. We've got a nice set of guidelines that we worked on with the Sustainable Ag Research and Education Program of USDA on cover cropping for pollinators and beneficial insects. A whole variety of things out there. Here's a crimson clover planting in between rows of an almond orchard in California that we worked on a few years ago. And we can think too, those were all big examples. We can get small too and just think about insectary strips. Here's crimson clover planted on a diversified organic farm in North Carolina, where the crimson clover is just interspersed with the vegetables. Here in California, just an insectary strip put on the ground here with phacelia and some early blooming lupins. You can do cut flowers and just have cosmos and zinnias and sunflowers. Why not? A lot of different ways we can get this bloom into the landscape and insectary strips. We can also just think about crop rotation. One thing we're doing a lot, or we're trying to ramp up in Eastern Oregon in tree fruit country and cherry country there, is as old orchards are taken out and new orchards put in, can we put in a huge mustard crop that's going to help attack disease in the soil. And at the same time, we let it go to bloom and it's providing a huge pulse of mustard bloom. Or maybe you've got a dryland cropping system and we're bringing canola into that cropping system and, you know, recognizing the value it can provide if it's protected from insecticide sprays, you know, for providing, again, another huge pulse of bloom, pulse of nectar and pollen in the landscape, and having that be part of a regular rotation so that every year somewhere within that landscape, you've got canola or another mustard or some other cover crop incorporated into just a cropping system, whether that's, you know, it's in the West or the East, just thinking about bringing in cover crops of value to pollinators and having them part of a rotation that's really designed for soil health and pest control. But hey, why don't we get this additional pollen and nectar benefit out of it as well? Alley cropping, we do a lot of work with the National Agroforestry Center in Lincoln, Nebraska, based out of Lincoln, Nebraska. I can't say enough good stuff about that team. And so, you know, thinking about alley cropping is another practice for that's particularly with climate change and thinking about carbon sequestration and carbon-friendly cropping systems. I think as time goes on, we'll hopefully be seeing more of these sorts of perennial woody plantings where we're getting, you know, a lot of resources from the, getting the same kind of resources we might need instead of maybe corn or soy from trees. And then in between those, maybe we're planting rows of cut flower or berries or nursery markets, or maybe we're just doing legume forage crops or, you know, cover crops for nitrogen, you know, to get nitrogen in the soil and at the same time providing pollen and nectar. You know, alley cropping can be a great way to get a diversity of cropping resources into the landscape. Hey, let's talk forestry for a second. One thing we're thinking more and more about is as forests are have been managed less and have been expanding dramatically, particularly in the eastern and northeastern United States is where I think about this the most, having spent about 10 years in upstate New York. You know, these forests can be encroaching upon pastures or farm fields. So maybe we're pushing back that farm edge, which gets more light and more air circulation on a crop field or a pasture. But at the same time, we create this feathered edge that, you know, without doing any planting, we might have milkweed and goldenrod and aster and like a whole variety. I think I've got jewelweed here, Joe Pyeweed. We might just have a whole variety of wildflower species that just are in the seed bank or just kind of, you know, make and do. But as soon as we open up sunlight on the ground, boom, all of a sudden we can have corridors of habitat that, you know, are running throughout these landscapes. I don't have slides, but, you know, we could think too about some selective thinning in those forests or some other forestry practices. Maybe we'll see what some of the foresters on board today are thinking about. But we're thinking, you know, could we go in and selectively remove some trees for, you know, anything from timber to firewood, and in so doing, release the understory in a forest, or even create some openings in a forest to create pockets of habitat in different landscapes. There's a lot of work, particularly on longleaf pine. It's been a big effort on this over the last decade or two in the Carolinas and elsewhere in the southeastern United States, where bringing disturbance back into these landscapes can, you know, bring them more to their natural state and release a ton of, you know, shrubs and wildflowers on the ground that really create amazing, you know, pollinator habitat. Silvopasture is another practice that I'm increasingly interested in. Even had some conversations recently with folks in cooperative extension in Western Washington. You know, how can we bring trees, whether they're pine trees or maple trees, out into different landscapes, create an understory of forage legumes where they're managed, you know, for cattle and other livestock to come in. And at the same time, you know, be providing these dual benefits for pollinator habitat, but also this interesting, you know, cropping and livestock operation. Just thinking about grazing management in general, I think there's a growing interest in and a growing need to think about drought resilience, to think about how do we cope with climate change, how do we manage rangeland to be more sustainable in the long run. And some of this has involved, some practices involve even running a few less cattle, but doing it, putting less work in. So maybe they spend more time in one area and you giving some ground a lot longer rest. And really, I mean, cattle become, and other livestock can become a hugely important management tool to lead to releases of bluebonnets like these down in Texas, or to create a landscape where, sure, maybe one year an area just gets hammered, and then the cattle are kept out of that for a long rest period, and then that area that just got really disturbed is able to just come right back up gangbusters. I think there's a lot we can do with grazing management that meets these flower diversity goals. Also, a lot of those flowers provide useful micronutrients for livestock, but we can meet the wildlife goals at the same time that we're trying to improve the sustainability and the drought resilience and protect riparian areas and other things in a lot of our grazing lands. I think there's just a huge opportunity here to marry together productive livestock systems with habitat. And if we look at pasture systems, a lot of the same applies. And we've got a number of collaborators in Wisconsin really stands out, where dairy operations there are maybe dividing their paddocks and making slightly smaller paddocks so they've got more of them, and doing very thoughtful prescribed grazing rotations that give your alfalfa or your red clover or your alsike or whatever it might be a chance to get more biomass to really go to flower. Maybe the nutrient quality of some of that forage goes down. For sure, it'll go down a bit, but the quantity, the biomass can go up significantly. And you can have just this amazing pulse of bloom for bumblebees and honeybees and other things. And at the same time, be part of a sort of more intensively managed, pasture system. And really, again, be having sort of multiple benefits on the ground. And we're looking hopefully to do more of this work in New England and other places in the years ahead. When we do have habitat, it's important, as I mentioned up front, to manage for that quality habitat. Here's some range land, a little bit wetter area in Idaho, where the landowner here is working pretty hard to manage whether or not cattle are getting in, so we can get some milkweed to bloom and rabbit brush and other things in the landscape. We also need to think about protecting that habitat as best we can. And Xerces has been working a lot on really getting to very crop and region specific integrated pest and pollinator management systems. We're working collaboratively with extension and with growers, trying to figure out how we bring together kind of the best sanitation and rotations and resistant varieties and conservation biocontrol and plant health, maybe bringing in mating disruption and pheromone traps, so that we can, avoid as much as possible even the need for chemical controls, and be thinking about also protecting those areas of habitat that we have on the farm. Can we set up buffers or setbacks, unsprayed areas of maybe 30 to 60 feet, where we're able to protect then our flowering habitat or different habitat on the ground, or creating pesticide drift barriers like these, where you've got something on your farm that's helping protect, well, maybe it's protecting you from spraying applications that are going on your neighbor's farm, but maybe it's even on your own farm where you're like, okay, hey, look, I know I've got to treat this area with insecticides. Let me see what I can do to help mitigate the movement of those insecticides onto any sort of habitat that I'm managing for or protecting. So again, it's not just creating habitat, but how do we protect that habitat? How do we mitigate some of the risks that might be out there? And there are great resources, a growing number of resources on how we design, for example, something like a windbreak to grab hold of insecticide or pesticide drift in the landscape. Well, and continuing along this lines, we need to think about managing invasive species, providing that intermediate disturbance. I talked a little bit, about grazing management, but also fire or haying. There are other things we can think about, about how do we not just maintain, but continue to improve the quality of habitat on the ground. And coming up in this series, the next presentation in this series is going to be on supporting pollinators on rangelands, particularly in the Great Plains, but also the Western US as well. So that's just coming up in a couple of weeks. We'll really dig into a lot of these ideas and not be me, but be a couple of our grazing land specialists who really, who know grazing, who know those landscapes a lot better than I do. And, related to the last slide I just was showing, other of my staff are going to be coming on to talking about how do we support pollinators over time and maintain wildflower diversity. So what are those, like how do we develop a plan where we assess current conditions and manage those conditions going forward in order to continue to build and expand the value of that habitat. So we've got a couple other things coming up, the soil invertebrates talk and getting to know like how do we scout for pollinators and other beneficial insects. Those are going to be great too, but these two in orange are ones that are just directly related to those slides that I was just sharing with you. So I've just been going and going here, putting like, from my perspective, I wanted to just do this sort of brain dump. Like here are all these different ways that Xerces staff have been working with farmers and ranchers and forest managers to get habitat on the ground in different ways. So this is the time where what would be great to get is what are your ideas? Like what are, things you've put on the ground that you've thought about, or that you've worked on specifically that you're like, Mace, why the heck didn't you talk about, this? I would love to sort of get your ideas, and you can go into the question and answer box. That's the place to go. And maybe while you all are thinking about that and going over there to put ideas, and they can be, super simple or as complex as you want, well, as complex as you can type into the Q&A. We can sort of come back to those. So maybe while we're waiting for that, I will, let me look at these two questions that are already in there to see what we've got. So Lauren asked, what pollinator plants do you recommend for a dryland, unirrigated area of Oregon? Oh, Lauren, that's a great question. I actually noticed that Garrett was on. Garrett is a conservationist, a planner for the NRCS in the Dalles, and has actually done a lot of dryland cover cropping over the years and put some really killer habitat on the ground that's included, Phacelia and some other things. As far as I'm concerned, Garrett, if there are a couple of high value plants you've worked on, you want to make sure that Lauren knows about, feel free to type it into the Q&A. But some of the things that we've put on the ground, some of the plants that go into perennial habitat that always seem to do well. Yarrow comes up. It's not my favorite. It's not the best pollinator plant, but it tends to do really well in kind of dryland Oregon. Rocky Mountain bee plant, or some of the bee plants, are annuals that I've been curious to see more planting of on the ground. For non-native plantings, things like Phacelia, if planted at the right time of year, seem to do pretty well. And that's the sort of thing I could dig in and work with some of my staff here and get you more of a list if you'd like, and I can follow up with some ideas of things that we've worked on and designed. I have to go back and look. We actually put together some plant lists for the Mosier area for some post-burn work just recently, and that was probably one of the more, and we've got some plant lists coming together for the Dalles area as well as for the Heppner area. Some things we're working on right now. So maybe get in touch and I can get you some other ideas. Let's see. Sarah writes, when farmers plant pollinator species in pivot corners, we see these areas taken over by undesirable species within a few years. Yeah, I know, right? Are these plantings still beneficial and worth the time and money given the short period of time they persist? Yeah, it's a huge, the weed control, particularly in pivot corners where there's already high weed pressure, can be a real challenge. This is where I feel like, and actually Corin, my partner biologist who's based here in Oregon, currently out of the Hillsborough field office, but working throughout Oregon and Washington, he and I were just talking about this yesterday. I think thinking about what are going to be some heavy hitters, some plants that might really, hold the ground, or worth thinking about. And this is where, we talked with and worked there with some growers in La Grande who went the route of putting down some low statured shrubs that were really aggressive as a way to kind of hold that ground a little bit more, to get up above those weeds and ideally outcompete those weeds. So that was one approach. I think the time necessary, if one's going to put in really aggressive site prep, try to knock those weeds back and focusing on even potentially plugging in some, again, aggressive perennials that are going to get a little bit of irrigation, a little bit of water, and maybe if they're mulched heavily and give you, more time. But I've been thinking more and more about, yeah, if you're going for something permanent and perennial, focusing on shrubs. The flip side is, hey, maybe it's worth just, cover cropping, putting something like spraying out the weeds as best you can and putting down a competitive annual and doing that for a few years and treating it as a temporary planting that ideally is, is a quick pass to, till up, do a little disking on the surface, trying to get weeds out of the surface area and putting some sort of less expensive and easier to sow annual cover and doing that for a while as a way to potentially get the weed pressure down over time, but have these pulses of bloom that come up. That's another idea that might be worth thinking about or talking about more. That could be interesting. Let's see, Lisa writes, I have an acre of asparagus planted with 4-foot row spacing and been wanting to plant something in between the rows for pollinators, for weed control, beneficial insects. Also 23 acres of planted prairie adjacent to your garden, 15 acres of wood. So, I mean, that's great. I mean, this makes me think about that example from North Carolina where extension there is, throwing some sort of a clover cover. And that, in the case of that example, that was just, an annual throwing crimson clover down, something where it was not a long-term investment in habitat, something that's, fall planted and you're going to get a nice pulse of bloom in the spring. And then you can just roll it down or, mow it down or crush it down. Might be interesting to think about something like that. Alyssum might be something a lot of people are putting, particularly in folks growing broccoli or leafy greens in California's Central Coast. There's a lot of alyssum being planted there in between rows. In fact, actually, we've got there's a great grower who's been really fun to work with in Eastern Washington. And he's planted alyssum, and this might be something going back, Sarah, to your question. He's planted alyssum on the drive rows going into his center pivot irrigation systems. It's aggressive, it's tough, it's cheap, gets, a decent bloom. I mean, is it the be all? Is it like the best pollinator habitat ever? No, but hey, let's get something useful on the ground. It's keeping the weeds out. It's feeding syrphid flies and parasitoid wasps that are going out there and attacking pests on the onion. Something like that might be a good interim, to get habitat on the ground, and maybe something, Lisa, to think about, in your landscape. And having, of course, prairie adjacent to woods. I mean, that sounds pretty idyllic to me. Let's see, Nick writes in, regarding conservation crop rotation example, could you elaborate on how seeding a late season mustard cover crop could improve soil conditions? The nutrient pulse for pollinators makes sense, but I'm not sure about the below ground component. And Nick, in my understanding of this system is if the soil health, the soil condition issue that's addressed with something like a mustard cover crop, and it's not necessarily late season in this case. In this case, we might be planting it early, getting a huge amount of mustard biomass up, tilling that in and packing it in, quickly packing it in, trying to seal it in, and it's really for dealing with soil diseases and soil microbes to try to knock back soil pathogens. So in terms of soil condition, it's more disease in the soil. That would be the focus of those mustard cover cropping systems, as opposed to building soil tilth. So sure, you're getting a lot of organic matter into the soil, but there's a lot of tillage and disturbance to that soil that's breaking up its soil, like the structure of it. So it's not ideal for that, but it's much more about soil pathogens in that case. And then if you're really focused more on, say, soil health outside of pathogens, yeah, then I'd be thinking more about other cover crops that, are going to be either adding nitrogen or organic matter where you're not doing the tillage and the disturbance, and maybe roller crimping it or mowing it and haying it or laying it down, whatever it might be. So that's what we were thinking. That's what I was thinking there with that conservation crop rotation, at least with the mustard example. Let's see, Lisa writes, love to get a local contact. Yeah, I'm actually gonna come back to that. Oh, you're in Western Wisconsin. Yep, I think we can help you out. I will circle around to that topic in a minute. Thinking about crimson clover, alyssum's great. What about, question is, what about berry or nut producing shrubs for wildlife food? Yeah, I mean, frankly, one of the things that's fun for me is even here around my house. I mean, I planted a lot of native fruit trees, crabapple, things like that, cascara, where we're going to have not just a pulse of bloom for pollinators, but then you're going to have this, whether it's mastine or soft fruit, available for birds and other wildlife. So again, a great place to marry together pollinator or beneficial insect, pollen and nectar resources, yeah, with another benefit, wildlife food. I mean, the other challenge is a lot of the landscapes where we work, the plants that we put in the ground end up being pretty yummy to deer. So, or to ground squirrels or whatever it might be, moles. So we also end up having doing a lot of work trying to protect those plants, whether it's protecting the roots with root cages or protecting the upper part with, tubes and other things to be able to get them going. But I mean, heck, it's another way to feed wildlife too, but we try to get those plants established first, but absolutely. All right, Craig, let's see what Craig says. One issue here in the Midwest regarding pollinator plantings is the availability of native seed. Oh yes. Our wetland restoration and oak savanna restoration, things like thinning and burning, getting more attention as places we can increase pollinators through management instead of focusing on planting. Short answer is yeah, oh, most definitely. I mean, let's go to that forest edge thinning and edge feathering example. I mean, that's one example that's been taking off in the Northeast, some in the Midwest too. Actually quite a bit in the Midwest, but getting more attention with my team in the Northeast, just because of that. A lot of our work in the Great Plains, especially the Southern Great Plains, again, has been focused on sort of savanna restoration and invasive species management and bringing disturbance back in, so that without even necessarily having to seed, taking advantage of what native plants are in the seed bank. And that's a great, I think management of what you have is actually a great thing to think about. So like I said, the forests are one example. And again, oak savanna or wetland restoration are two places there. In a lot of cases, if you've had invasive species or things have gotten too thick, maybe it won't work because you've lost the seed bank. But certainly the first step is always to give those management actions a try. For example, in wetlands, restoring the hydrology of a wetland and seeing what comes up. I mean, hopefully you're not already inundated with reed canary grass. And if you're not, maybe just restoring the hydrology, all of a sudden your marsh marigolds show back up and your chelone and other cool wetland plants that, just maybe you haven't seen as much, but just needed to be re-wetted. So I actually think that's a great idea. The flip side of that is too, Xerces and a lot of our partners are working closely with the native seed industry to try to bring more habitat, more plant materials into production. Let's see, let's keep going here. Yeah, Lisa, great. Thank you very much for that. Let's see, Nicole writes, I have Christmas tree farmers in Minnesota who are looking for mixes to plant underneath and between the Christmas trees in the alleyways. Any recommendations of easy species that would work in that situation? I feel like, Nicole, we could go so many different directions. And actually, there's even data from John Tucker when he was in the University of Illinois, I think. He's now at Penn State University as a professor there. He's got a great example of Christmas tree operations actually dramatically reducing their pesticide applications by allowing their understories to grow up to have more bloom. And that might have even just been weeds, just because of the increase in beneficial insects that were attacking a lot of the Christmas tree crop pests. So there is, I think, some clear examples from the Midwest as to why having, habitat underneath Christmas trees is valuable. Again, I think we could probably go the route of cheap forage legumes and cheap mustards and things like that in that understory, but also could probably design something that focused on having plants that were a little shorter statured, because certainly those Christmas tree growers are going to want to come in and keep the competition at a minimum. But I do think there are these benefits from having bloom there that we've seen in terms of reduced pest control costs and reduced pest pressure. And that's one where it'd be interesting to bring in our staff in Minnesota, based north of Northfield in that area, down in the southeast corner of the state, over by Wisconsin. We could probably put some ideas together for you. But yeah, understories of in Christmas tree operations, it's a great place to have habitat. I was at a Christmas tree farm in Western Washington a year or so ago, and they just had clover planted through underneath the entirety of their operation, just Dutch white clover, and they were getting soil nitrogen out of it and keeping the weeds down. And I was there midsummer, and it was in full bloom and looking great with a ton of bees in it. I'm just seeing here, if any other thoughts are coming in, feel free to keep chiming in. One thing that came up the last time I gave this talk, which cracked me up, but which is also something I've thought about before, is, if you're looking, actually, I'm going to go back and mess around here with this slideshow. Let's see. Let's see if that works now. Let's do a different color. Give me a second. Let's do pointer color. We're going to do orange, and then we're going to erase all of this. If you're around the farmstead, just planting, around the whole barn, people have been just planting ornamental shrubs that have value for pollinators and just make that whole landscape look prettier. That's one thing that people have been doing. Where you've had leach fields, people have been planting their leach fields with wildflowers or just cheap flowers in the landscape. That's been something that like folks have talked about that I found. I was like, yeah, why not? Like, as long as your roots aren't going to go down there and mess up the drainage tile you've got in your leach field, that's a fine idea. We've got these wet areas throughout fields that aren't productive because the soil's just a little too damp. If you're able to protect those from insecticide exposure, maybe you're losing money on habitat like that. And so these are places to get those grassed waterways or areas of bloom, or, even something like a prairie wildflower strip into the landscape, especially if you can protect that from insecticide exposure, coming in either through the water or overspray. Around irrigation ponds, we've been talking a lot with the cranberry growers. You need to keep those open and accessible. But again, maybe you've got a side that you're putting in buttonbush and willow and I don't know, sweet pepper bush or dogwood or other things, where you can get that pulse of bloom. It's going to help stabilize a bank. And you can still make sure you keep areas open to be able to manage that, maybe that irrigation pond, but still you're getting that habitat sort of tucked around. Here's an area where you could have, livestock coming in, or maybe this is a forest that's been thinned a little bit to release the understory, or here's that edge that's been pushed back. Let's see. Oh, got a couple more coming in. So Sabrina writes, we're starting a pollinator garden that's about a 1/4 acre in size on a conifer farm. Oh, in the Panhandle of Idaho. Okay. The land is currently covered in weeds. How would you suggest preparing the soil prior to planting and seeding for native plants? So in that case, I think, we're looking at, it depends a fair amount too on what tools are available. Are you able to use insecticides, or are you trying to go organic? In that neck of the wood, I would probably focus, if you are able to use something, like glyphosate and be really targeted with that, I would probably do, you could go the route of just some sort of chemical fallow and, spraying out the weeds. I'd probably get the bed 1/4 acre in size. I'd get the bed prepped first. So if you're going to be seeding that, and then be hitting those, like putting the more energy you can put into weed control up front, and this gets at the pivot corner issue and other things, the more effort you can put in up front, the higher the likelihood that you're going to, managing those weeds in the long run will be doable. So I would do something like that. I mean, there are other techniques for a quarter acre that you could use if you didn't want to use insecticides. So you maybe let me know and I could think about those. And we've got good resources on our website that would guide you through all of those options, whether they're organic or conventional, a ton of resources there. And just south of you, you've got some great folks at the NRCS down in Moscow. I'm not sure how close you are there, being up in the Panhandle, you might be actually pretty far. But there's some folks down in Moscow who've been, Pamela Pavic comes to mind immediately, who's been doing a lot of beneficial insect projects over the years with NRCS, if she's still there. And if you want some additional site-specific help, yeah, get in touch and we can help you out there. Jacob writes, in a field setting like we have in Southwest, Minnesota, where we have limited fence lines and large blocks of continuous disc fields, how do you, and what areas would you recommend we look at incorporating pollinator habitat into those fields? The only real pollinator habitat is in scattered CRP. So CRP, for those who don't know, is areas where land's been taken out of production and the Farm Service Agency, in collaboration with NRCS, helps plan and then pay for kind of a rental payment to cover the cost of that land, and it's put in some sort of cover, habitat on the ground. In those giant fields, I think this is where, it's a real struggle. You've got the efficiencies of large fields, it's there for a reduction of any of those edges. That's probably an area where I would be, one thought that comes to mind is to think about bringing crop rotation back. And I recognize that's been something that's happening less and less. I feel like there's that great Iowa rotation of soybean followed by soybean followed by soybean, and oh, hey, maybe some corn. Ideally, we're bringing more crop rotation in that in and of itself can help both break a lot of pest cycles and also potentially incorporate something that's going to have some bloom. But I think, here, if you're able to give some protection, roadsides become one area. I think looking at the least productive areas of crop fields, where maybe, if there's an efficient way to take some of that cropland out of production because it's not producing, sometimes it's just more efficient to run the seeder through, right? And we lose, quote unquote, lose money on that wet area, but it's easier to do that than to go around it. But maybe there are some areas where it's worth taking that time, to go around, where one can efficiently incorporate some sort of habitat. I worry though, with so many of the insecticide seed treated crops that are out there and flying on insecticides, sometimes it's pretty hard to create that habitat in the way where you're not going to have pesticides in it. But if somebody's interested, that's a thought. I'd be focused too on homesteads and service areas on the farm, and thinking about those as being potential places where you can create areas of habitat. They're not going to be big, but it might be a way to get some habitat into that landscape. That's one thing that comes to mind. I probably also, even when those big landscapes that are so large, there are going to be wet areas that are worth taking out of production, or little streams or places that should be streams, ephemeral or permanent. Or maybe one makes the case that from a soil health perspective, it's worth reintroducing some grass waterways and breaking those fields up just a little bit, and trying to find that balance of efficiency and pockets of habitat, where again, I think I'd be going back to multiple goals of conservation, multiple goals, natural resource conservation goals, besides just beneficial insects, and then thinking about how to incorporate beneficial insects into that. So those are some of the things, Jacob, I'd think about in that landscape if I was, plopped on a corner of a section there, looking out over those fields with a map in hand. Just some of the things that I would be thinking about, and maybe thinking too, how do we tie, have some connectivity between those scattered CRP fields, for example. That might be something else to think about in that context. That is certainly not what we're seeing here in this picture. This is much more that idyllic, like there's not idyllic necessarily, but there's just a lot of different things going on in this field here. All right. Well, I think we've hit all the questions and all the ideas that have come in. One thing I will say moving forward, I want to just wrap up by talking about resources, one of which, well, okay, one thing we came up with years ago is a brochure that's meant to help people think about, we did this in collaboration with NRCS over a decade ago, thinking about this landscape and where you might find habitat in it. So that's something that's available from the NRCS or from Xerces. We can get you copies of those if you want. Those habitat assessment guides that I talked about are available online, as well as a ton of other guidance for getting habitat on the ground. So some of the questions you all asked can be addressed by a lot of these publications that you can go to our website. In fact, if you go to our Pollinator Conservation Resource Center, you can get easy access to those assessment guides. Oops, 1 second. Let me get rid of this. All right, you can get access to installation guides and plant lists and management guides and pesticide protection guidelines and monitoring identification tools, as well as native seed and plant vendors. Just a ton of information here at our resource center online. Books that we've written over the years on native pollinators and feeding the bees and gardening for butterflies and farming for other native beneficial insects, just a lot there. Can't say, like I said, enough good stuff about our collaboration with NRCS. And so there are a lot of resources available from NRCS, many of which I alluded to already, that you all are able to tap into. And if you're really gung-ho, you can go to the field office technical guides that NRCS manages. This is where NRCS staff go to get the latest and greatest that they're supposed to use for doing conservation planning work in their areas. But if you go here and select on your state and then do a keyword search for pollinators, you can find all sorts of stuff that NRCS has put together all across the country. And this question came up from a couple of you. We've got staff, Xerces have staff, particularly for those that are partner biologists with NRCS, those are the red stars, that are able to reach out and work with you. So if you're, in California, if you're in Oregon, Washington, anywhere in the Great Plains, from Wisconsin and Iowa, all the way through the Northern Great Plains, all up and down the East Coast, get in touch. I should have put it on here. You can email me, but better to email pollinator@xerces.org, and we can connect you. Just email me or email pollinator@xerces.org, and I'll put that email will be up here in a second, and we can try to connect you with somebody who can provide technical assistance for free to help you think about the Christmas tree farm, or if you're in southwestern Minnesota, like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do there? Karen will have, she'll help with ideas, and help you think about that. Like I said before, we've got a couple other webinars coming up on beneficial soil invertebrates and wetlands. This is with NRCS, as well as our Xerces Pollinator series. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel and go there to get archived talks like this one. Connect with us on social media. We've got a steady stream of fun stuff coming out there. And I just want to say thanks, and we'll take any last questions you might have. And like I said, you can email me. I'll probably connect you with my staff who are more locally based and who can help you out with local questions, based on that map that I showed before. I should have put that up here too, so you can keep looking at that. So with that, I just want to say thanks to all of you. Thanks to Rachel for setting this up, and to our closed captioner who's been helping with that. Yeah, we're going to call it good.